Hi everybody, it's Whitney from All the Shelves. When I first started my YouTube channel in January, I made a video with 5 nonfiction recommendations. And in that video, I promised that I was going to keep recommending nonfiction things. And while I have been reading nonfiction and reviewing it and summing it up in my wrap-ups, I haven't kept that promise. So this video is going to include 5 more nonfiction picks that I really loved and I think you might enjoy too. My first pick is Men of Tomorrow, Geeks, Gangsters, and the Birth of the Comic Book by Gerard Jones. A few people who've been watching my channel have expressed some interest in my research area. When I put it in those kind of highfalutin terms, it sounds ridiculous. I study early American superheroes from about 1938 to about 1950 is where I kind of cut off somewhat arbitrarily. I tried to cut off at the end of World War II, but then I just wanted to talk about the Lone Ranger, so it went up till 1950. Anyway, that was a tangent. This book has been indispensable to my studies. It's just a popular history about early American superheroes. So I've turned to it when I've needed little facts about, you know, how popular certain characters were, or the biographical sort of details of the character's creation. Like there's a lot about the two boys that created Superman in 1938. It talks a lot about their inspirations and then the kind of mass influence they had on popular publishing in that time period, so that there were all of these characters that were just immediately created. Within 4 years there was Superman in 1938, Batman in 1939, Captain America in 1941, the very beginning of 1941, and then Wonder Woman at the very end of 1941. So within 4 years there are 4 major superhero characters that continue to be extremely prolific up until, you know, they're making the movies. The Civil War just came out, right? This book doesn't try to be academic at all, and in that way it has some shortcomings as far as I'm concerned, but that also means that it is very readable, really fun to read. Gerard Jones is both careful in his scholarship but also finds the things that people might find actually compelling. Once again, that is Men of Tomorrow, Geeks, Gangsters, and the Birth of the Comic Book by Gerard Jones. The next book is a memoir. It's called Born Standing Up by Steve Martin. Steve Martin is one of my very favorite comedians, but I didn't quite know that before I read this book. Like a lot of kids born in the 1980s, I was familiar with Steve Martin through his film work through the 1990s and not so much his stand-up comedy, and so it was a real surprise to me when I read this book and I found how funny he was. Obviously he's funny, he's like a renowned famous comedian, but even just the way that he tells his story, this is like a fairly serious book. It's pretty straightforward. He's just describing kind of the steps that he took to become a successful comedian. Even just that story was so funny to me. Somehow, even while describing his bits, and I am not going to describe one here because I do not have the talent that Steve Martin or even some very minorly successful comedian has at telling jokes. I'm terrible at it, but Steve Martin is really good at it, and he tells sort of the experience of his life through the different bits that he did, his different writing on television, and then it ends when he becomes a really successful film actor with The Idiot. I read this next book a long time ago, so I can't recall the exact details of it, but just the general direction of the book and some of the facts and details that she spouts off will suddenly pop into my head, and I feel like a much smarter person having read this. This is Assassination Vacation by Sarah Vowell. She's hilarious. If you don't know, Sarah Vowell has published a lot of nonfiction. She started as a kind of essayist, and then she moved into writing more popular histories, and the last one she did was Lafayette in the Somewhat United States. That one was really good, but Assassination Vacation continues to be my favorite. I don't necessarily think that that's because of the style of it. I always respond well to Sarah Vowell's style, but the topic of presidential assassinations is so fascinating to me. Maybe that sounds really morbid and maybe I'm going to be put on some kind of watch list now, but I'm fascinated by the type of person who would take it upon themselves to change the direction of an entire country, be that people in power like presidents, but also people who want to destroy power like assassins. Okay, that makes this sound like a much deeper sort of book than maybe it is. Mostly it's her going around with either her sister or her nephew or some friends that she persuades to go to these historical sites with her, and she goes around the country finding out really tangible and material details about the people who attempted these assassinations and sometimes succeeded. It's really good. It's really funny. You could read it in a day or two, and honestly it's time for a reread because I feel like I read it so quickly that I've lost some of the information now. My next recommendation is Legacy of Conquest, The Unbroken Past of the American West by Patricia Limerick. Patricia Limerick is a very renowned, somewhat famous historian and scholar who writes about the American West, and this is probably her most well-known book. Legacy of Conquest is a kind of survey of American Western history, but even if you feel like you know a whole lot about Manifest Destiny and the Turner thesis and the, Roosevelt thesis, whatever, she offers a lot more to the conversation about minority voices in the West, and also she denies that the West was closed for settlement in 1890, which is the general consensus, or it was before her, that what we know as the Wild West ends in 1890, and then I guess something emerges from that. I don't know what it is, the civilized West, or usually just like a sort of assimilated American experience. She denies that argument, and she also rejects the idea that the West and the story of the West should be the story of white settlers in the West. So her book begins long before white people started infiltrating the Western landscape, and it ends far after the kind of period that we know from Western films. It's a fascinating read. There's just so much information just packed into this. I really think that everyone could learn something from this, and it's also something that if you were only interested in a certain aspect of Western history, you could just read a chapter or two, and the chapters work as little mini essays. My fifth pick is The Hot Zone by Richard Preston. This is a very popular book. It was a bestseller. I don't know that so many people are rereading it now, but there was a resurgence, was it last year or 2 years ago, when Ebola was a big deal? I think that was last year, when there was that huge Ebola outbreak. A lot of people went and bought and read The Hot Zone again, and I was one of those people, and I became obsessed with Ebola, not just the current news cycle around Ebola and how people were responding to it, which was really interesting. Lots of discussions going on about race and how race is represented in the media and how infectious diseases are sort of tied to specific races, but also, I was just interested in the evolution of the disease, where it came from, what it does to the body. I got into some really morbid details and research. The Hot Zone started all of that, and this is a book that I could see people accusing of sensationalism, so I would be careful about that going into it. It's not a academic, dry, objective look at the disease in any way. It is a narrative of the disease, and he tries to include as many gross, unsettling details as he can. I listened to this on audiobook, and I gave it to my mom to listen on audiobook as well, and she was flying somewhere, I don't remember where, and she was on the plane listening to The Hot Zone, which if you were on a plane in the middle of the last Ebola outbreak listening to this book, I feel like that is one of the worst ideas you could have. Not only that, but she was reacting so viscerally to this book on the plane that the man next to her kind of got into a conversation with her about what she was listening to, and it turned out that he had been in bat caves and had contracted a disease that at first seemed like perhaps it was the Ebola virus. So she was like literally sitting next to a man on an airplane who potentially had Ebola. Yes, it was 10 years in the past and she was in no danger, but if I were her, I would have been absolutely terrified. I would have run to the bathroom, sought out a flight attendant, found a new place on the plane, and probably put the book away. The Hot Zone really is that effective. I gagged a couple times. I was kind of like, as I was reading the book, talking about, mucus on the tongue and whatever. If that sounds appealing to you, this is like a dream come true of a book. It was one of those nonfiction books that really felt like fiction because the narrative was so strong. So if you don't mind a little exploitative discussion of infectious diseases, you might really enjoy The Hot Zone. Those are my 5 new nonfiction picks for you. If you've read any of these, which I chose some popular ones, so I suspect some of you have, or if some of these sound especially interesting to you and you want to know more about them, let's start a discussion in the comments, and I will see you later.